To understand how a catastrophe of this scale is even possible, we have to look at the invisible geometry of the location. It was essentially a deadly sandwich. On the surface, you had Lake Peigneur, a shallow, freshwater body of water, barely 3 feet deep in some places. It was a peaceful spot, known for its botanical gardens and weekend fishing trips. But directly beneath the lake, 1,300 feet underground, lay a different world entirely. This was the Diamond Crystal Salt Mine. It wasn't just a pit, it was a subterranean metropolis. The mine consisted of miles of wide tunnels with ceilings as high as cathedrals carved out of solid salt. On the morning of November 20th, 55 miners were down there. They were driving trucks and operating heavy machinery, confident that the millions of tons of rock above their heads kept them safe from the water above. But on the surface, the Texaco oil company was hunting for a different resource. They believed there was oil trapped near the edge of the salt dome. They set up a $5 million drilling rig right on the water. The plan was precise: drill down carefully, miss the salt dome by a safe margin, and hit the black gold. But in the world of high-stakes engineering, precision is only as good as your data. And on November 20th, the data was fatal. The engineers on the rig were calculating their position using a transverse Mercator projection map. The mine below, however, was mapped using a local coordinate system. Nobody checked the conversion. It was a simple triangulation error, a mistake that you might make in a high school math class. But out here, it meant the drill was not where the crew thought it was. It was drifting off course. Instead of missing the salt dome, the 14-inch drill bit was aiming directly for the roof of the mine. They were about to punch a hole in the ceiling of a dry room while standing in a bathtub. The physics of what would happen next were not just dangerous, they were apocalyptic. We are about to witness one of the most expensive mistakes in history. But before the drill hits the salt, I have a request. If you appreciate documentaries that respect your intelligence and explore the limits of human survival, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. It helps us dig deeper into these archives. Now, let's return to the lake, exactly at the moment the math failed.
At 7 a.m., the drill bit seized up at a depth of roughly 1,200 feet. The crew on the platform heard a series of loud, rhythmic pops echoing up the pipe. It sounded like metal snapping under extreme pressure deep beneath the water. Within minutes, the massive rig began to list to one side. The captain didn't hesitate. He shouted the order to abandon ship. The workers scrambled off the platform, jumping onto a support barge and speeding toward the shore. They looked back, expecting the rig to settle into the mud. Instead, they watched the impossible. The 150-foot-tall derrick didn't just tip over, it vanished. In water that was supposed to be shallow enough to wade in, a multi-million-dollar structure disappeared completely beneath the surface. It was the first sign that the bottom of the lake had ceased to exist. Usually, if you poke a 14-inch hole in a mine shaft, you get a manageable leak. But this was salt. When fresh water is forced into salt under high pressure, it doesn't just flow, it devours. The incoming water instantly dissolved the salt surrounding the drill hole, turning a narrow puncture into a gaping crater within seconds. The lake wasn't just leaking into the mine, it was being sucked in by gravity, creating a vortex of unimaginable power. While the oil workers watched in shock from the shore, a nightmare scenario was unfolding 1,300 feet below. The 55 miners scattered across the underground city first noticed the lights flickering. Then they heard a low rumble that quickly grew into a roar. But the most terrifying warning wasn't the sound of water, it was the wind. As millions of gallons of lake water displaced the air inside the tunnels, hurricane-force winds began blasting through the mine shafts. The evacuation alarm screamed through the darkness, "Get to the lift, now!"
It became a desperate race against the rising water and the crushing air pressure. Miners drove their trucks at breakneck speeds through the dissolving tunnels toward the central elevator shaft. They piled into the small metal cage, shoulder to shoulder in the pitch black, waiting for the lift to ascend. As they ascended, the cage shook violently, battered by the displacement winds trying to keep them down. They were the only living things standing between the bottom of the lake and the surface, and the gap was closing fast. By the time the last miner stepped out of the elevator and onto solid ground, the lake they knew was gone. In its place was a churning vortex of mud and debris that looked like something out of the Old Testament. The whirlpool had grown to a quarter of a mile wide. It began to claw at the shoreline, ripping away huge chunks of earth. The catastrophe wasn't satisfied with just the water. It wanted the land, too. On the nearby Jefferson Island, the famous Rip Van Winkle Gardens, a botanical masterpiece, began to slide. Spectators watched in disbelief as 65 acres of land broke off and slipped into the churning water. Centuries-old oak trees, trucks, and a newly built conservatory were swallowed whole. But the most surreal sight was on the water itself. 11 massive barges, loaded with drilling mud, were caught in the current. These were heavy industrial vessels, yet the vortex spun them around like plastic toys in a bathtub. One by one, they were dragged into the center and pulled down into the mine, disappearing into the dark throat of the earth. The suction created by the emptying mine was so violent that it did something physically impossible. It reversed the flow of nature. Lake Peigneur was connected to the Gulf of Mexico by the Del Quembre Canal. Under normal conditions, fresh water flows out of the lake and into the ocean. But as the mine drank the lake dry, the vacuum became stronger than gravity. The flow of the canal turned backward. Saltwater from the Gulf of Mexico raced inland, racing upstream to fill the void. As the ocean poured into the empty crater of the lake, it created a temporary waterfall. For a brief window of time, the flat wetlands of Louisiana held a roaring cataract 150 feet high, the tallest waterfall the state had ever seen. The crater continued to fill. The compressed air trapped in the mine shafts had nowhere to go but up. Geysers of mist and debris shot 400 feet into the air, exploding out of the mine shafts as the tunnels flooded. It was a chaotic symphony of earth, water, and air, all fighting for space in a hole that man had accidentally punched through the world.
For 2 days, the violence continued until the mine was completely flooded and the pressure finally equalized. Then, as the water settled, the lake offered up a final, bizarre surprise. The barges that had been sucked down into the depths didn't stay there. As the salt dissolved and the air rushed out, the submerged vessels were shot back up to the surface. One by one, like corks released from a bottle, 9 of the 11 barges breached the water, battered and dented, but floating once again. But the true miracle of Lake Peigneur isn't the physics, it's the survival rate. Looking at the footage of the whirlpool or the size of the destruction, you would assume the death toll was catastrophic. But when the head counts were finally tallied, the number was 0. All 55 miners escaped the underground trap. Every worker on the oil rig got off in time. Even the fisherman, Leon Savy, managed to paddle his small boat to shore just before the vortex could claim him. The only lives lost that day were 3 dogs kept at the Botanical Gardens, a tragic footnote in an otherwise miraculous escape. The lake, however, was changed forever. It was once a shallow freshwater reservoir. Today, it is a deep saltwater basin, permanently connected to the tides of the Gulf of Mexico. The ecosystem was entirely replaced. The freshwater fish died out, replaced by ocean species. The error on the map didn't just destroy a mine, it rewrote the biology of the landscape. The Lake Peigneur disaster stands as a terrifying monument to human fragility.
We build massive structures, we drill miles into the crust, and we believe we have mastered our environment. But this story proves that the ground beneath our feet is not as solid as we think. All it takes is one wrong number, one miscalculation on a piece of paper to turn the Earth into a weapon. Sometimes the Earth swallows the evidence, other times the sky does. In our next file, we will look at the man who stepped out of a plane at 10,000 feet and walked straight into legend. Was D.B. Cooper a criminal genius, or did he freeze to death before he ever hit the ground? Subscribe to the Red Archives and join us as we hunt for the truth. See you in the next one. Of course, when an entire ecosystem disappears in 3 hours, someone has to pay the bill. In the days following the disaster, the blame game began. Texaco blamed the drilling company blamed the map makers, the mine owners blamed everyone. But the math didn't lie. In the end, Texaco and their contractors agreed to pay $32 million to the Diamond Crystal Salt Company for destroying their mine. They also paid nearly $13 million to the botanical gardens for the loss of their land and, well, their peace of mind. Adjusted for inflation, the cost of that one calculation error was nearly $160 million in today's money. Today, if you visit Lake Peigneur, it looks quiet, but locals know better. They know that 1,300 feet beneath the keel of their boats, there is a drowned city, a preserved moment in time, frozen in salt and water, where 55 men once worked, and where a 14-inch drill bit still sits, stuck in the rock, the most expensive needle in history. Now, I want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell me, do you believe this was purely a mistake, or in an industry worth billions, was this a case of negligence, cutting corners to save time? I'll be reading the best theories in the first hour. This has been a file from the Red Archives. Don't forget to check your coordinates. We'll see you in the next one.